Humans are typically thought of as primates, and there's increasing evidence that we really diverge very widely from chimps and gorillas that are genetically, behaviorally, in terms of the design of our brain and our endocrine system, even anatomically, that we're really not much like them, and that we probably can't infer much, if anything, about human behavior based on the example of primates.
Every schoolboy has been told that to understand human nature, we must look to our closest genetic relatives, the chimpanzees. Jane Goodall's pioneering research revealed that chimps use tools, hunt cooperatively, and engage in violent activity that looks like warfare. And from these observations, she and generations of scientists who followed in her wake have concluded that humans are essentially advanced primates, and that our behaviors, from violence to sexuality, flow from this genetic inheritance. But what if this foundational assumption is wrong? Welcome to the Tikvah podcast. I'm your host, Jonathan Silver. The Primate Myth, Why the Latest Science Leads Us to a New Theory of Human Nature, is a new book by the playwright and critic Jonathan Leaf. Jonathan has absorbed vast quantities of scientific literature, and he argues that recent genetic and neuroscientific discoveries are overturning decades of conventional wisdom. A landmark study published in April 2025 revealed that humans share only 86.5% of our genes with chimps, not the 98.6% we've long believed. More importantly, the differences are concentrated precisely where they matter most, in the structures of our brains that govern cooperation, empathy, and language. Leaf's thesis is both scientific and moral. If humans are not primarily aggressive primates, but rather cooperative pack animals, closer in crucial ways to dolphins and wolves than to chimps, then it's high time to reconsider the natural impulses that lie at the roots of war, of family, and of human flourishing. If you enjoy this conversation, you can discover more big ideas and in-depth analysis of Judaism, Israel, America, and the West at tikvahideas.org. Subscribe to access our full library of podcasts, videos, and essays, and join a growing community focused on Jewish life and the glories of Western civilization. You can subscribe to the Tikvah podcast on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, or Spotify. I hope you leave us a 5-star review to help us grow this community of ideas. I welcome your feedback on this or any of our other episodes at podcast@tikvah.org. If you are interested in supporting the podcast and bringing these conversations to a wider audience, we welcome sponsors. Please email us at podcast@tikvah.org. And of course, if you want to learn more about our work at Tikvah, you can visit our website, tikvah.org, and follow us on Facebook and X. Here now is my conversation with Jonathan Leaf. Jonathan Leaf, welcome to the Tikvah podcast.
Thank you so much for having me here. It's wonderful to be back in the Tikvah community.
Congratulations on this new book, The Primate Myth. What's the book about? What's your argument?
Well, humans are typically thought of as primates, and there's increasing evidence that we really diverge very widely from chimps and gorillas that are genetically, behaviorally, in terms of the design of our brain and our endocrine system, even anatomically, that we're really not much like them, and that we probably can't infer much, if anything, about human behavior based on the example of primates. That's really what the book's about. And it's an argument that's consistent with the theory of evolution. I'm not arguing against the theory of evolution. Evolution says that animals rapidly adapt to their evolutionary requirements, but our evolutionary requirements are completely different than those of chimps and gorillas. So it follows from the theory of evolution that we would not be much like them. And the evidence increasingly is that that's so. In particular, a study came out just as we were finishing the book, but it was consistent with some earlier studies that have appeared over the last few years. And it was done by over 123 of the world's top geneticists, including the leaders of the Human Genome Project and the top geneticists from the National Institute of Health. And they showed that humans are not that closely related genetically to chimps. It turns out that we're not 98.6% the same as has been commonly claimed. It's more like 86% the same. So that's 9 or 10 times less closely related genetically. So to conclude that we would be much like chimps, it doesn't really make much sense.
Well, so just in this, off chance that not every one of our listeners is himself a geneticist, let me just ask, very, very obvious question. So, okay, we used to think that we're 98% like chimps, and now we're only 86% like chimps, or whatever. That still sounds like an awful lot like chimps.
Not really, especially since a lot of the differences are in things like the brain, the things that control us. And there are parts of the brain that seem to be completely different. Also, even animals that are very, very close genetically, like lions and tigers, which can produce fertile offspring, they can be very, very different. Even subspecies of animals, like different species of zebras, can be actually very, very different. So when you get to a divergence this large, and it's one that took place over hundreds of thousands of generations, at least 300,000 generations, not 300,000 years, 300,000 generations. So we're talking about 5 to 8 million years. You're going to have very, very big differences. And these have turned up in the genome, but they're also indicative of differences in fundamental makeup, what you might call nature.
Okay, so Jonathan, what I'd like to do is enter into some intellectual history and ask you to sort of present the common sense view of the subject before this study with all these 123 top geneticists came out. Why is it that we at one time did think? What evidence did we at one time have that this chimpanzee-human connection was so intimate, that we shared so much of our genetic makeup? And then tell us what was wrong with that.
Well, there's a bit of herd thinking. One of the points of the book is that humans in some ways may be a bit of a herd or a pack animal, and that's really how we survive. But herd animals don't really think for themselves. They adopt ideas from those around them, and they perpetuate them. And we can see this in many aspects of human life. But the field of anthropology and the field of primatology seem to have engaged in a certain amount of this. Now, just very recently, Jane Goodall, who is you could argue the foundational figure of the whole field of primatology, died in her 90s. And she's an extraordinary woman. She did amazing, amazing things. But we could think of her a little bit like Christopher Columbus. I know Columbus is now increasingly under attack for his character. Jane Goodall is someone whose character is not up for debate. Everyone seems to think that she was an exemplary person. But she's like Columbus in that Columbus did very brave things that changed our world. And Jane Goodall did very brave things that changed our world. However, both of them seem to have misunderstood, or at least at times misunderstood, the conclusions that could be drawn from their research. So Columbus thought, at least some of the time, even at the end of his life, that he'd gone to the East Indies, not the West Indies. And we know, of course, that's not true. Jane Goodall did research that showed that chimps are unbelievably violent animals that are much more violent than any group of humans, even that you'd find in a supermax prison. She also showed that they engage in things like filial cannibalism. That is, they will eat their own young, they'll eat babies from their own tribe. She showed that they never know paternity. That is, they never know who the father of the infant is. They're extremely promiscuous. She revealed a whole series of things about their nature and their behavior, which show they're very different from humans. She was a very empathetic person, and she obviously wanted to think of chimps as being like people, but even she had to acknowledge late in her career that they're very different. But I don't think she appreciated the full extent to which her research indicated that.
Okay, so I want to just begin to step into the different sorts of evidence that we can use to try to understand this puzzle. You began by pointing us to the fact that there is new genetic studies that show a genetic differentiation, which is greater than what we had previously thought. But it sounds like what you just told us about what Jane Goodall may have misunderstood about her own work is rooted not in the study of genetics, but instead the observation of human sociology, or the way that we behave. And by tracing our violent tendencies or lack thereof, and our capacity for fidelity and devotion, maybe just say something about these different sorts of evidence and how they guided you in your study of the book.
Well, the first thing that got me interested in this question, one of the first things, was a study was done by someone else who created a contraption in which they offered chimps 2 ropes. And one of the ropes they could pull and get a meal for themselves, and another they could pull and get a meal for themselves and another chimp. It cost them nothing to get a meal for another chimp, and it had no effect on their behavior. They chose the ropes randomly. They also can't share food with other chimps they don't know. They call this co-feeding. If you put them in a room with a chimp they don't know, They won't share the food. They'll just beat, the larger one will beat the other up until they get the food. They have since shown, there's a lot of neuroscience showing that the parts of the brain that deal with empathy in humans, the anterior cingulate gyrus and the amygdala, function completely differently in humans than they do in chimps. They're very sociopathic animals. And for reasons that I hope we'll get a chance to get into, this is consistent with the theory of evolution. It's not inconsistent, it's consistent. They're just very, very different animals. I talk about in the book an experience I had that further intrigued me and also has to do with the importance of language. I've had a career as a novelist and playwright, so this interested me. I was with a friend in Stuyvesant Park in New York City, and he loves dogs, and he was with his dog, and he reached over and whispered into my ear that he was going to Pennsylvania, this is from New York City, in his car to visit his wife, who was with their daughter in Pennsylvania. And he didn't want the dog to hear the word car because the dog understands the word car, and he knew the dog would be very upset. And it struck me that that's something you couldn't even conceive of with a chimp. If you've ever seen chimps up close, and most people have only seen baby chimps, like Bubbles, the Michael Jackson chimp, or in movies they see baby chimps. But if you see adult chimps, they're really terrifying animals. They don't listen very well. They actually don't learn words very well in the way that dogs do. And this struck me as peculiar. Why is it, if they're so like people, that you would never have this kind of connection or this ability to understand what's going on that you'd have with a dog? Because we were told chimps are so smart. So this struck me, something's got to be wrong with this theory that has been fundamental to the field of primatology.
Okay, so if a reader comes to your book thinking that humans evolved from chimps and that they are our closest genetic relative, and comes to be persuaded that that's not true, so what's the difference? Why does that matter?
Well, half of that is true. We didn't descend from chimps, but chimps and humans have a common ancestor about 8 million years ago. So we do have a common ancestry with apes. However, apes and all primates are fundamentally different than humans. And in fact, we don't meet the definitional requirements of the primate order. This is something you'll rarely hear mentioned, but is true. All primates have two common characteristics. One I'm about to show. This is the, I don't know if you can see it clearly, but a flat nail. All primates have flat nails, not claws. The second is that all primates have what are called prehensile feet. They're basically an extra set of hands that are feet. And they have that because they live in trees. Even gorillas, as enormous as they are, and even geladas, which are largely terrestrial, do go up in trees. The geladas to avoid predators, the gorillas to eat tree leaves. So they have a basic diet. The diet is to a large extent based on things they find in trees, particularly, tree leaves, nuts. Humans are a totally different kind of animal. Humans don't have prehensile feet, so we don't meet the definitional requirements. And I might add, and this is a little bit of a digression, but I think a significant one. In my lifetime, I'm not sure if yours, because I think you're a little younger than I am, Jonathan, but in my lifetime, there were 6 families of primates, and one was tree shrews. Tree shrews do have prehensile feet, but they don't have flat nails. They have claws. And at some point, it was decided, since they don't meet the definitional requirements, they should have a separate order, which is now called Scandentia. Humans also don't meet the definitional requirements of the order, but we were kept in the order. Now, the irony is that tree shrews actually have a lot more in common with primates than humans do. Humans don't live in trees. We don't climb trees. We don't live in trees. We don't eat tree leaves. We became a terrestrial animal, but we don't have any of the equipment to be natural carnivores. We don't have claws. We don't have big glaring canines. We're not fast. In fact, we have a lot of endurance, which is characteristic actually of herd animals. We have the endurance patterns and the sleep patterns of herd animals, not primates or carnivores for that matter. But our diet came to be, to a large extent, a diet based on big game hunting. So this raises an obvious question. How did we engage in big game hunting? To give an extreme example, we actually hunted woolly mammoths. In fact, we probably hunted them to extinction. Now, these were elephants that were, or pachyderms, that were 50% bigger than any existing elephants on the earth today, bigger than African elephants. And they were probably at least 100 times the size of people. And the weapons we were using to hunt them were just like pikes and spears. Now, you can't hunt elephants today, even with handguns. They're just too dangerous. They will kill you. And in fact, people who hunt elephants use elephant guns. These are special guns that are with a giant bore cartridge, or they use machine guns and poison. So it raised the obvious question, how did we do this? Well, it seems that what happened was we learned to be a very stealthy creature, a very cooperative creature, and we use language, and we work together to attack elephants in groups and to drive them into pits, it seems, as well. This required a completely different kind of animal, an animal that's really very social, that gets along easily with one another, and that is very, very focused on the ability to speak and communicate. Well, that's nothing like chimps. It's nothing like chimps, it's nothing like gorillas, and we don't rely on a diet of tree leaves. We don't even eat tree leaves.
What did your research teach you? Not about what distinguishes humans from chimps or our common ape ancestors, nor about the things that we may share with other kinds of pack animals. But instead, what did your research teach you about the human difference, the things that we don't share with anybody else?
Well, I think there's nothing wrong with using animal models. We need good animal models. So dolphins, and increasingly research seems to suggest that elephants, speaking of elephants, do communicate to some degree using language. We know that wolves are cooperative hunters, and dogs, their ancestors, are cooperative hunters, especially hounds. So there are commonalities with other species. But clearly, the extent to which we use language appears to be very far superior to other animals. And so we have to be super sensitive to the meaning of words. So one example I give in the book, which is certainly not original, but if you've ever seen either the play or the movie, The Philadelphia Story, there's a scene where Katharine Hepburn is reproached by her fiancé about her behavior on the night before their presumed wedding. And he says, he's upset that she's in the movie gone for a midnight swim with Jimmy Stewart. And he says, a woman should behave herself naturally. And Cary Grant, who wants to get her back, says, a woman should behave herself naturally. Now, the sentences are actually identical. So how do we know that they mean different things? Well, we have to be super, super aware of other people. And, most of us are. And much of the time, we're very, very aware of what other people are thinking and doing. We're very preoccupied with what they're thinking and doing. And our identity comes from that. We really worry about, does the person next door have lawn ornaments that are nicer than mine? Is the person next door also a Giants fan? These kinds of things. That's a very particular type of animal. And again, it's very tied up with our use of language. In fact, a point that's often made and should be made is that when humans are born, when we are born, we can't walk. Now, almost all animals can get around effectively when they're born. We're what's called neonates. And for an entire year, even though we have big brains for control of our bodies, we can't walk. Now, that raises an obvious question. Why can't we walk? Well, it seems that the reason we can't walk is that the main thing we're doing the first year of life is we're trying to develop language skills. We're involved in language acquisition. And that's more of a focus and more of a need for our survival than the ability to walk. So that's really, really different than not only primates, but probably almost any other animal. And there are other animals, for instance, we know now that name their children. Not only do dolphins do it, it seems that some parrots do it. But that's still not the same thing as, spending the first year of your life preoccupied with what did that person say? What does it mean? How do I communicate?
Well, of course, that is deeply connected with one of the effects of the fact that we can't walk, not a reason for it, perhaps. Though there has been some theological writing that suggests that it, in fact, is a reason. Nevertheless, what I'm thinking of is an effect of the fact that we cannot walk for the first year means that the mother-child relationship has got to be so much more intimate, and that is a natural source for what socially, religiously, existentially comes to be the family. And that is distinct from other animals in quite the same way. I want to actually return to your examples, Jonathan, that you gave. Number one, of whether someone is a sports fan of the same team that I am, and whether someone has lawn ornaments that I covet. And those two examples seem to me to reveal something else. They point towards an internal life that suggests that some of the social patterns that we observe and some of the genetic material that science can help us discover is not a sufficient account of the human person in and of themselves. Because the sports team that we come to admire, of course, is chosen. It is not natural to us the way that other kinds of necessities are. Now, I know that some people are going to be born as Mets fans or born as Yankees fans, but it is not natural. It is not sewn into the fabric of the human condition in the same way. It's an elected affinity, and the lawn ornaments that we covet is very much taught to us. We don't naturally like the gnome or the flag or the giant Halloween decoration, or dislike them. Those are tastes that we acquire in society. And to me, it points toward a kind of social sophistication and interior life that it seems to me to be distinguished from other animals, even pack animals.
Yeah, I'd strongly agree. Though it's not primary. It's not really what the book is about. But it also gets to humans have a powerful need for identity. And, a gorilla or a chimp doesn't really think a lot about who I am, not only because they don't have language, though I don't know that you need language to think about these kinds of existential questions, but they're very egocentric. They don't think about, am I doing the right thing? Am I a good person? All those kinds of questions just never occur to them.
So maybe let's step into one of the case studies that reveals some profound distance, some great distance between the way that we had conceptualized ourselves and our origins in reference to apes and chimpanzees, and the way that you're inviting us to see ourselves in reference to other kinds of pack animals. Tell us what your research has taught you about war and the propensity to collective violence in the name of some purpose in the human condition.
Yeah, this is really important. Okay, first off, let's talk about chimps. Chimps kill each other at just astounding rates. One study was done at how often people who observe chimps, and you usually don't observe chimps up close because they're just too dangerous. They can rip your face off, they can pull your arm out of its socket, they can bite your fingers off, etc. Even though they're basically herbivores, they will bite your fingers off. So I'm talking about adult chimps, not only male but female as well. So, observation is usually done with binoculars, but they found that the average primatologist who is out in the field looking at chimps will see a corpse of a chimp killed by another chimp once every 3 years, actually less. And once every 8 years, they'll actually see a chimp kill another chimp. So they do it with enormous frequency. Also, if you're in West Africa, there's a real chance you'll see a chimp, when it's on the ground, be killed by a leopard, because they really can't protect themselves from leopards. They don't have the kind of herd instincts for protection that humans have when they're terrestrial, which is one of the reasons they spend a lot of time in trees and they're careful about running up the trees when they see a threat coming. Okay, anyway, all that said, from this, people had inferred that the impulse towards war was a human impulse that we derived from chimps. But if you actually look at the evidence, it doesn't make any sense. For one thing, and this is a point I first became acquainted with through the work of a primatologist who believed that human impulses towards war were primate impulses, Franz de Waal. But de Waal pointed out the most warlike of all animals is actually the ant. And all the animals that we use in our wars, like dogs and elephants and horses and camels and dolphins and sea lions and pigeons and so forth, they're all docile animals. And in fact, all human wars are undertaken under the guidance, the aegis of authoritarian leaders. And when you remove those, humans don't seem to engage in war. So it turns out that if you look at democratic countries in which women vote, there is no record of them ever going to war with one another. They don't even keep troops on the border. France and Germany, for all the wars they fought, they have no troops on the border. The United States has no troops on the border with Canada, nor does Canada have any with us. It's taken for granted that problems and conflicts can be resolved peacefully. But when you have autocratic leaders, and whether we're talking about Xi or Putin or Yahya Sinwar, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly, they like to start wars, and they have obedient young males who will follow them. And a further proof that this is so is found in, we're not the homicidal maniacs that chimps are. We don't immediately incline towards war. Is found in a famous set of experiments that many people may be familiar with called the Milgram experiments in the early 60s. Stanley Milgram showed, and it was then, these studies were replicated all over the world, that if you told people they were engaged in a science experiment, that they would torture other people. They would give them electric shocks and they would torture other people. However, when people were not given a guiding authority, if they were just brought in and they were given this equipment and said, do a study, they never tortured other people. It's when people are following a leader, particularly young men, that they can be convinced to engage in collective violence. And we actually can see that if you just think about it all. What do you do when you recruit young men into an army? You don't teach them to be violent. You teach them to be obedient. And humans are an obedient animal. We're a domesticated animal. We are tame. And what you do is you cut off their hair and you drill them and you try to get them to be as obedient as possible so that they will go out and from a feeling actually of love, of camaraderie for the soldiers around them, they will fight other people and they will follow propaganda telling them that this is just and correct. So it seems that the problem of war is primarily a problem of our tame nature, our tameness. It's our obedience that makes us dangerous to each other collectively. When we are not given dangerous, psychopathic male leaders, we don't do this. and this has profound implications, and I want to refer to this because it's Tikvah, but also because it's important to note. Israel has been trying since its founding to reach a two-state solution, to reach a process of peace with the surrounding states, and in particular the Palestinian people. And we know from his diaries, which weren't published during his lifetime, that Ben Gurion was looking for years and years and years for someone among the Palestinian leadership that a kind of peace could be achieved. No such person existed. Humans are naturally, not only are we naturally obedient, we can easily even be drawn into cults, including cults in which we kill ourselves or others. And that's to a large extent what, for instance, Hamas is. It's kind of a death cult, sort of similar to what existed in Japan leading up to the Second World War and through the Second World War. But I don't know if there's a Hirohito out there, someone who's going to step forward among the Palestinians and say, we have to make peace. And that's obviously a huge problem for Israel. And it's reflective of the fact that, democratic peoples don't seek war. Hamas sought this war.
So this is a philosophical argument with a very distinguished pedigree, what is known as democratic peace theory that extends, that is articulated in precisely this way back into the Enlightenment. One thing that I notice that you do as you develop the idea is that you add a gendered qualification to it. They're not just democracies in your hands, but they're democracies in which women vote. Tell me about what you discovered that made that qualification important, that enriched your understanding of this dynamic.
Well, it's empirically true. I mean, that's when democratic countries stopped going to war with each other. Yes, Kant, you can go back to Kant. Kant talked about this, but Kant didn't talk about it in these terms. It turns out that the parts of our brain that are associated with empathy, in particular this thing, the anterior cingulate gyrus, are actually larger on average, not in every case, on average in women, and that the size of the anterior cingulate gyrus corresponds to the extent to which people are empathetic. They've also found that psychopaths have a smaller anterior cingulate gyrus, and it's even been found when they did studies of prison inmates that the size of the anterior cingulate gyrus was predictive of whether they engaged in recidivism. Small anterior cingulate gyrus was predictive of psychopathic behavior continuing into the future. So it may be that because women are on average, not in every case, they're obviously female psychopaths, we all read about them, but the women tend to be somewhat more not psychopathic and empathetic, that the addition of women to the electorate, which has had a whole series of effects, including probably expansion of government and the welfare state, but it's also reduced the risk of war. There may be other reasons. That's one I would say I would point out that the book talks about.
So going back, I want to. This is going to sound a little strange, but let me stand up for authoritarians for a moment and see if I can try to see that from a different angle of vision. You could say, look, authoritarians deploy propaganda to seduce domestic animals such as us into obedience, and then point that obedient military force toward their own purposes. But I could come at you from a different argument that is rooted in somebody whom you reference in the book, rooted in the philosophy of Thomas Hobbes and a different understanding of human nature, and try to tell you a similar story that actually accepts some of the elements that are your point of departure in your analysis. You see, it's precisely because the human animal is naturally quarrelsome, is naturally warlike, that in order to have domestic tranquility, we need somebody to suppress the warlike impulses in all of us. And once we have that sovereign that is powerful enough to suppress all of the violence that would be breaking out all over, that violence can be channeled and tamed and put into some kind of national purpose. But if we don't have that kind of sovereign, if we don't have, in the way that you described it, that kind of authoritarian leader, it's not that there will be no violence, it's that there'll be so much more violence, all of it directed without a common purpose, all of it unorchestrated. It will be disordered chaos.
Well, I actually agree to a very small extent. Twice in my life, once when I was in high school and once just before COVID broke out, I was in communist countries. I went to the Soviet Union when I was in high school, and then I went to Cuba with my wife the Christmas before Hanukkah, before COVID. And they're very safe places. I mean, if you commit a crime, you're in a lot of trouble, and there's very little street crime. That's absolutely true. Of course, they commit a lot of crime against their own people. They throw people into the Gulag or into Pinar del Rio or whatever it is, and then they start wars against other people if they have the opportunity. in the case of Castro, I mean, it's been reputed that during the Cuban Missile Crisis, he was calling Khrushchev saying, no, 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 start a nuclear war. So, in terms of the capacity for collective violence, it just doesn't seem to be empirically true. I mean, what Hobbes was saying doesn't make a lot of sense. He may have been a genius. I may not be qualified to judge, but it just doesn't seem to be true.
I'm not sure that only those those horrible communist countries that so profoundly immiserated their own people is the right and natural example of that kind of insight. But you're of course right. It does point us toward this eternal tension between freedom and security, freedom and order, and those are places in which there could be very high levels of domestic order, very low levels of freedom, and that is not a trade-off that we would want. That for sure true. Even so, is the political implication of your argument that if you want to have less war in the world, then you need to promote democracy and have women involved in public affairs?
I don't know the extent to which we can, I guess gets a lot of the questions of neoconservatism. I don't know that we can do much to make other countries democratic, but I think we have to be aware that countries that are not democratic are not peaceful with respect to their neighbors, including the democratic countries. And I think the UN, I don't talk about this in the book, but I think the UN was a misguided idea, probably the League of Nations too. The idea behind these organizations was if you get a group of very wise men, and they're really thinking of men, together, they will work to end war. But what actually happens is you get a bunch of servile henchmen of dictators who meet with decent and honorable people from democratic countries, and they actually just try to, the servile henchmen are doing everything possible to prevent the resolution of tensions, may even be encouraging that. And we saw that with UNWRA, where they were actually facilitating Hamas aggression, or where Sudan became the head of the UN Human Rights Commission. I mean, or recently China, was certainly preventing any kind of UN action against Russia after it invaded Ukraine. So and Russia itself was preventing that. So the dictatorial states it's not like their representatives are working for peace. They aren't. They're doing what people do. They're behaving obediently on behalf of their leaders.
And that would suggest not a more aggressive democracy-promoting foreign policy for the United States, but instead a recognition of the limitations of that kind of multilateral political arrangement.
I guess so. Yeah, I guess so.
Jonathan, of course, war is one important dimension of the human experience, and so is the formation of the family and the promulgation of the species and the rearing of the young. What did your research teach you about that?
Well, humans are very unusual in that we take so long to raise. And as we talked about, humans are neonates. When we're born, we need the care of a parent, really ideally two parents. And there are various indications that very early on in human evolution, we became a monogamous species. If you go back 300,000 years, that's a long time. That's at least 15,000 generations. We had a very low level of what's called sexual dimorphism. And sexual dimorphism just means the difference between the size of males and females. Male and female body size is pretty close. It's below, the difference between the two is less than 1.2 to 1. Maybe even in some groups it's as little as 1.15 to 1. And the lower the level of sexual dimorphism in general, the more monogamous a species is. Species that are highly polygamous have very large differences in the size of the males and the females. With gorillas, it's over 2 to 1. That is, the big male gorilla is huge. You can see it in lions. I think everybody's familiar with this, that the lion is much bigger than the lioness and does very little work. And they're somewhat polygamous. They usually have, a couple of mates. So humans, we know just from that, we have a clear clue that we're a monogamous species. But more recently, research has turned up on what's sometimes called extra-pair-fertilization or false paternity. That is, the percentage of children who wrongly believe that someone is their father. And it turns out all over the world, including in places like West Africa, the rates of false paternity are very, very low. They're usually like 2 or 3%, sometimes under 2%. And that's lower than any other mammal species ever studied. It's also lower than famously monogamous bird species like swans. So that raises a question, why do we have such low rates of false paternity? And it seems that the answer is that we need two parents together involved in raising a child. And if you look at the societies around the world where polygamy has become normative, and we can even look here in the United States, if you compare the official Mormon church and the so-called traditional Mormon church, where they have these groups of kind of outcast Mormons who live in Nevada and Mexico and other places where they have, men have 5, 6 wives, etc. The polygamous cultures are always disastrous. One of the things I talk about in my book is there's a book promoting polyamory, the idea that we can just, not be monogamous, that we can sleep with random people and it won't affect our marriage. And the authors of the book pointed to a tribe in Quebec where they had much more collective child rearing, and they presented this as a very successful society and said that should be a model for us. But they didn't bother to do any research. This book, by the way, called Sex at Dawn, has sold over 250,000 copies and has influenced a lot of people. Somebody told me everybody in Park Slope seems to be reading it and telling you that they're a polyamorist. And it turns out that if you actually look at the history of these people in Quebec, this Indian tribe, or what Native American, they have incredibly high rates of child mortality, infant child mortality. And that's something that's seen all over the world. That's true among these traditional Mormons. It's true in Malawi. When you have something other than a monogamous culture, it turns out it has a lot of conflict. You have a lot of child death. They don't work. They're really, really unsuccessful societies. Not only that, but in some ways more seriously, it even turns out, and this is very politically incorrect to bring up, maybe not more seriously, but worth noting, perhaps less seriously, since the introduction of gay marriage, an interesting thing has been noticed, which is that it had always been assumed that the gay couples that would have a high rate of divorce would be male homosexual couples because they tend to be more promiscuous than lesbian couples. But actually the opposite has been true, and this is seen in every country that's adopted gay marriage. Male homosexual couples have not had particularly high divorce rates, higher than heterosexual couples, but not particularly high. Lesbian couples have very high divorce rates, often twice as high as male homosexual couples. And this raised the question, why? What's going on? Well, it seems that the purpose of sex, to a very considerable extent with humans, is not procreation, it's pair bonding. And that gets again to how important connecting humans to each other in a traditional nuclear family, maybe not necessarily traditional, but certainly a monogamous nuclear family, really is. It's very important, and it's a crucial aspect to a healthy society. This is a point that's really worth making, especially now that there are all sorts of people promoting polyamory. And by the way, I reached out to one of the leading primatologists promoting this, and I asked to debate her, and I've asked her a number of times, and she won't respond. In fact, this has been an issue with a whole series of primatologists that I've contacted. I've pointed out that my book is getting good reviews. People are talking about it. That Nature study showed that people are not genetically very close to chimps. I said, why don't we do a debate about these subjects? None of them wanted to debate me. In fact, the only one I could even get to respond to me was Jared Diamond. And he said, well, I haven't talked about human-chimp relations in 30 years, so I'm not doing this.
Well, The Primate Myth, Why the Latest Science Leads Us to a New Theory of Human Nature was just published this year in October 2025. Jonathan Leaf, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. Such a pleasure.